When 10 gunshots echoed through a quiet Utah church in December 2019, the congregation froze. Some screamed. Some dropped to their knees. One woman whispered, "Finally." The shooter didn't run. She lowered the gun, stared at her father's lifeless body from the pew, and waited. What followed wasn't just a murder trial. It was the unraveling of a decades-long nightmare that had been quietly killing the Sutter family from the inside. Behind that pulpit wasn't a holy man. It was the same man who seduced his son's girlfriend, who sabotaged his wife's brakes, and who reduced the woman who once loved him into a forgotten amputee in a wheelchair. This story wasn't about a fall from grace. It was about a family no one ever bothered to look at closely, until the daughter pulled the trigger. And once the investigation began, the question shifted from, "Why did she shoot him?" to, "What took her so long?" In the quiet residential edges of Washington County, Utah, the Sutter name carried weight, but not the kind built on wealth or public status. It was simply known. A family that had lived in the area for decades, active in community functions, never too loud, never too absent. Dennis Sutter worked as a preacher, though not the kind with television cameras or megachurch sermons. His ministry stayed local, rooted in small-town familiarity, where congregants doubled as neighbors and church business blurred easily into personal life. He led Sunday services, officiated weddings, and buried the dead. People respected his role. Few questioned his character. His wife, Lorene, was quieter by nature. She had once worked part-time at the county library and was known by those who crossed her path for her soft voice and calm presence. She was the kind of woman people described as stable, not because they knew her well, but because she didn't make noise. The Sutters had 2 children. Micah, the younger, was outgoing, athletic in his teen years, and had a reputation for being headstrong. Tonya, the elder, was more reserved, watchful, observant, and often misunderstood as distant. But those closest to her said she carried her mother's loyalty and her father's fire. Behind closed doors, however, the family lived on edge. Several former neighbors would later testify that tension had long simmered inside the Sutter home. Dennis, while composed in public, was described by one former friend as controlling, especially with the people closest to him. He didn't shout. He simply didn't bend. Lorene, despite her quiet demeanor, had withdrawn even further over the years. When asked, Dennis would say she wasn't feeling well. That was all. Micah and Tonya, by all accounts, shared a bond in childhood. But as they grew older, their paths diverged. Micah remained close to his father, joining youth church programs, while Tonya grew increasingly uncomfortable with the church's structure and culture. She eventually moved to a neighboring town after finishing school, distancing herself from her father's reputation and her mother's silence. The first real spark didn't come from within the family. It came the day Micah brought someone home. In early 2012, Micah Sutter brought a new presence into the family's orbit. Her name was Chanel Boone. They'd met at a community sports fundraiser in Cedar City. Chanel was bright, soft-spoken, and in her early 20s, working part-time and taking courses at a nearby college. The relationship moved quickly. Within a few months, Micah invited her to Sunday service at his father's church. She became a regular face in the pews and eventually joined the family for dinner at the Sutter home one evening. That night, something changed. Though nothing inappropriate happened at the table, those familiar with the case would later point to that first meeting as the origin point of a quiet but devastating betrayal. Dennis Sutter, by then, in his late 50s, had always carried himself with an air of composed authority. And Chanel, young and eager to impress the family, was attentive. In interviews after the shooting, She described the moment he began making advances as slow and gradual, like stepping into water you didn't realize was rising. Dennis reportedly began calling Chanel under pretexts, questions about her spiritual life, her studies, or offering guidance. The tone shifted subtly over time. Then, it didn't. One evening, he invited her to a weekday counseling session at the church. She accepted. She later told investigators she believed she was going to talk about Micah. Instead, the relationship between Dennis and Chanel escalated into a secret affair. For Chanel, the situation became tangled. She was still dating Micah, but she was also entangled emotionally and sexually with his father. Her age, relative inexperience, and desire to be accepted into the family blurred the boundaries. She kept quiet. Over the next several months, the affair continued. Dennis remained outwardly unchanged. He preached sermons, attended prayer groups, and stood beside Lorene on Sundays. No one noticed the difference, except for Tonya. She had been distant from the church for years, but she had her own observations about Chanel's sudden closeness to her father. She never said anything then, but she took mental note. The relationship between Dennis and Chanel lasted beyond a season. It lasted years. Long after Micah stopped asking questions about her whereabouts, long after the relationship with his son faded into quiet silence, and for years, no one outside those two knew what was happening. Until the phone call. It was a small, careless moment that unraveled everything. Micah Sutter had stopped by Chanel Boone's apartment late one evening in the fall of 2014. They were still together, though not as connected as they once were. The warmth had faded, but the routine remained. They had dinner, talked, slept together. Chanel left her phone on the bed as she went to clean up in the bathroom. Micah wasn't searching for anything. He simply picked up the phone when it buzzed. It was a text from a contact saved under the name Daddy Deluxe. It wasn't a nickname he recognized. Curious, he opened the thread. The last few messages made no attempt to hide their intimacy. One, in particular, made his stomach turn. What followed was instinct. Micah checked the number. His face tightened. It belonged to his father. He didn't speak. He didn't wait. He left the apartment that night without telling Chanel. Witnesses later described seeing Micah return home around midnight. According to Tonya, who was visiting Lorene at the time, he walked through the front door and went straight into the kitchen, where Dennis was still awake. No one knows the exact words exchanged, but it escalated fast. Micah confronted Dennis. Dennis denied everything. Then, according to police reports, he accused his son of disrespect and told him to leave the house as a man who couldn't be trusted. Lorene tried to intervene. So did Tonya. Dennis wouldn't back down. Micah was forced out. He never returned home again. But the night wasn't over. Around 2:15 a.m., less than 2 miles from where Micah was last seen, a young woman was assaulted in a dimly lit alley behind a bar. She couldn't see her attackers clearly, but she told police one of them matched Micah's build and hairstyle. Surveillance footage placed him near the area. A discarded jacket resembling one he had worn earlier was found nearby. Micah's arrest came 48 hours later. He was charged with aggravated sexual assault. Despite a lack of conclusive DNA evidence, the circumstantial case was strong. 2 eyewitnesses placed him near the scene. His prior argument with his father was framed as emotional instability. The prosecution built its case around timing, proximity, and rage. Micah was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was 21 at the time of sentencing. Lorene never recovered from that night. She visited him twice in the first year, then once more the second. After that, she stopped going. not out of rejection, but because she began to unravel in private. Micah's cellmate later recalled that he kept mostly to himself. Like someone who got locked up for something bigger than he did, he said. And back home, Chanel and Dennis never missed a Sunday service. After Micah's imprisonment, the Sutter household entered a quiet disintegration. There were no public outbursts, no visible scenes. But inside the home, Lorene Sutter began to fade. She stopped showing up at the church, citing exhaustion. She withdrew from her closest neighbors. Friends who had once seen her at grocery stores or on morning walks said she seemed absent, even when she was physically present. The weight of her son's conviction, layered with the unresolved questions about the night he was arrested, sat like a shadow in her chest. But the most corrosive element came not from the court, but from inside her own home. Dennis Sutter no longer kept his affair secret. With Micah out of the picture, and no community suspicion, he began spending more time with Chanel Boone. She was seen near the church during off hours. Once, she was spotted leaving the Sutter home while Lorene sat in the back porch with headphones on, staring straight ahead. Tonya, who had by then moved into an apartment across town, remained in close contact with her mother. Lorene never said much over the phone, but she hinted at things: discomfort, distance, betrayal. Tonya kept her tone measured, but she was listening. As time passed, Dennis reportedly grew colder toward Lorene. Several former parishioners recalled moments where he would speak dismissively of her health. By 2016, Lorene had stopped driving altogether. She rarely left the house. According to a medical report reviewed during later investigations, she was diagnosed with chronic depressive disorder, compounded by anxiety and insomnia. But she never accepted psychiatric treatment. She reportedly told her doctor, "I'm not sick. I'm just tired of being here." But what no one outside the family could see was that the situation hadn't plateaued. It was only sinking deeper. A breaking point was coming, and it would begin, unexpectedly, with a trip to see the only person Lorene still trusted. In late 2017, Lorene Sutter took a rare trip outside Washington County. She traveled alone to Beaver, Utah, a small town where her elderly stepmother, Edna, still lived. Edna wasn't just family. She was the only parental figure Lorene had ever trusted. After surviving years of childhood abuse at the hands of her biological father, it was Edna who raised her, protected her, and gave her structure when the rest of her world had collapsed. Their bond had endured across decades and distance. The visit was unannounced but welcomed. Edna, then in her late 70s, lived in a modest clapboard home near the edge of town. The two women reportedly spent that evening talking over tea and looking through old photographs. It was the first time in years Lorene had been somewhere that felt safe. Shortly after midnight, safety disappeared. Two men, both known in the area for prior petty crimes, broke into Edna's home through the kitchen door. They believed the house was unoccupied, or at most, occupied by one elderly woman they assumed would be too weak to resist. They were wrong. Edna attempted to defend her home with a kitchen knife. Lorene tried to hide in a hallway closet and call for help, but her phone had no signal. The next 15 minutes were chaos. Both women were sexually assaulted. Edna sustained fatal blunt force trauma to the head after attempting to fight back a second time. Lorene was beaten, left unconscious, but survived. It was a postal worker making an early delivery who found the front door ajar and called authorities. Lorene was discovered in the back bedroom, bloodied and in shock. She was taken to Beaver Valley Hospital, where she remained under psychiatric watch for 4 days. During that period, she spoke very little. What little she did say pointed to trauma far deeper than the immediate attack. Edna's death was officially ruled a homicide during a home invasion. The two perpetrators were later identified and arrested following DNA matches and a neighbor's statement about two unfamiliar men seen on the property that night. But while the criminal justice process moved forward, Lorene did not. The death of Edna, her last protector, triggered a psychological break that, according to court-submitted psychiatric assessments, erased her will to return to her prior life. She never returned to work, never returned to church, and barely left the house again. And as her emotional condition worsened, Dennis became increasingly distant. According to Tonya's later statement to police, her mother once told her, "It's like living with a stranger who's waiting for you to disappear." But Lorene wouldn't disappear. Not yet. Dennis Sutter, her husband, continued to preach on Sundays. He still visited homes, counseled couples, and remained active in church administration. But inside his own home, his patience for Lorene had eroded into open disregard. According to audio recordings later recovered from Tonya's phone, Dennis was heard telling Lorene, "You've become a weight. I didn't marry someone who needs to be carried." The recordings were made secretly by Lorene and shared with her daughter during one of her visits. On at least one occasion, Lorene openly wept into the microphone while Dennis berated her from across the room. But it wouldn't be words that pushed the situation over the edge. It was the break line. In the fall of 2018, Lorene, after weeks of isolation, attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy. She had started seeing a local therapist and had committed to attending her first session in person. Dennis, according to a neighbor, watched her leave the house that morning but said nothing. Less than a mile from the home, while turning off a residential road, Lorene's vehicle failed to slow. Witnesses reported seeing the car veer into oncoming traffic before colliding head-on with another sedan. The impact left both vehicles heavily damaged, but it was Lorene who suffered the worst outcome. Her legs were crushed beneath the dashboard. Emergency responders had to cut through the car to retrieve her. She was flown to St. George Regional Hospital, where both legs were amputated below the knee. The crash was initially ruled an accident, until a mechanic working with the insurance company flagged the brake system. The pads had been deliberately tampered with. The clips securing the front pads had been removed. Surveillance footage retrieved from a nearby auto supply store later showed Dennis Sutter purchasing a brake toolkit 5 days before the incident. No charges were ever filed. When asked about the purchase, Dennis claimed it was for routine vehicle maintenance. Authorities cited a lack of direct evidence tying him to the actual sabotage. Tonya, however, never questioned who was responsible. In the months that followed, Lorene remained in a wheelchair. Her weight dropped rapidly. She no longer had the strength or interest to leave the house, even when transported. The only thing she continued doing, quietly, methodically, was recording conversations, and giving those recordings to her daughter. After Lorene lost both legs, Tonya took on the role no one else seemed willing to fill. She helped with hospital paperwork, coordinated her home care, and delivered groceries when Dennis wouldn't. In those quiet moments, sitting beside her mother in a living room no longer full of life, she began to collect more than just receipts and medical forms. She began to collect evidence. But the digital trail didn't end there. Lorene had also kept printed text messages, scribbled notes, and one flash drive containing what she described as insurance. The contents included audio of Dennis referencing the brake tampering, phrased vaguely but damning in tone. A voice memo where he stated, "She won't be around much longer, and I need someone who can still meet me halfway. In life and in bed." Screenshots from Chanel Boone's social media accounts showing her tagged at Dennis's home address over the years. Tonya began to compile these items into folders, physical and digital. She didn't take them to the police. She didn't contact a lawyer. Instead, she listened. She listened to her mother recount how her father once ridiculed her wheelchair behind closed doors. She listened to the story of how Edna's murder broke what little resolve her mother had left. By mid-2019, the pieces of the puzzle didn't feel like secrets. They felt like weight, and they were crushing her. And the more Tonya learned, the more she realized. Her father had dismantled their family one piece at a time. Micah, her mother, even Chanel Boone, who had once been seen as the source of betrayal, now appeared to Tonya as another manipulated link in Dennis's chain of control. It was around this time that Chanel's situation came into sharper focus. She had married a man with a drinking problem and had 2 children. Both children, according to DNA tests later released in court documents, were fathered by Dennis Sutter. Chanel would later describe the relationship as emotional entrapment, not just a consensual affair. She claimed Dennis used guilt, threats, and the fear of public shame to keep her quiet and keep her close. But none of that eased what had already been done. Tonya knew her mother wouldn't survive another blow. She also knew the legal system wasn't coming. The brake pads weren't enough. The recordings hadn't drawn action. Her brother was still behind bars, so she made a decision. One she didn't share with anyone. Not her mother, not Chanel, not even her own husband. She stopped collecting evidence and started preparing for retribution. December 15th, 2019, began like any other Sunday at the small-town church in Washington County, Utah. It was nearing Christmas, and the congregation gathered as usual, dressed in layered coats, some holding paper bulletins, others sipping coffee as they greeted friends. The sanctuary was warm, lit with soft lighting, and filled with the hum of routine worship. Dennis Sutter took the pulpit at 10:03 a.m. There were no signs of tension, no warnings, no alarms. Among the seated members that morning was Tonya Sutter. She entered quietly through the side aisle and sat toward the back. Hooded coat, black gloves, hands tucked into her lap. The only unusual thing about her was how still she sat. No songbook, no bowed head during prayer, no movement. According to witnesses, Dennis had just begun his sermon when it happened. The first shot cracked through the chapel like a dropped thunderclap. Then came the second. Then 8 more. Tonya stood from her pew and emptied the entire clip of her husband's legally registered 9mm Glock into her father's chest and torso from fewer than 30 feet away. He dropped instantly. No cries, no final words. A wave of confusion followed. Screams. A stampede of retreating churchgoers. Someone pulled a child beneath a pew. Others ran toward the exits, not realizing the threat was over before they ever understood what it was. Tonya didn't flee. When local police arrived at 10:12 a.m., they found her standing beside her father's collapsed body. She raised her hands without resistance. In the report submitted later, the arresting officer noted she said only one thing at the scene. "He has 10 bullets in him. Man needs to burn 10 times more in hell." The scene was secured. Shell casings were marked. Witnesses were ushered into a separate room for statements. Inside Tonya's coat pocket, officers found a folded handwritten letter addressed to her brother Micah, who was still incarcerated at the time. It read, in part, "I know you told me not to carry this weight, but no one else was going to lift it." News of the shooting traveled fast, but few knew the full story. To the outside world, it looked like a cold-blooded execution. To those who had lived inside the Sutter family's shadow, it was the first real moment of truth. But the consequences were just beginning. The aftermath of Dennis Sutter's killing sent a ripple of confusion through Washington County. While the headlines focused on the dramatic nature of a daughter gunning down her father in church, the truth behind the act took weeks to surface. And even then, it arrived in fragments. Tonya Sutter was charged with first-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty by reason of diminished capacity, citing years of documented emotional trauma, neglect by law enforcement, and accumulated abuse evidence. Her legal team submitted dozens of recordings, journal entries, and corroborating testimony to build a timeline of familial breakdown and personal collapse. But it wasn't just Tonya's case that drew attention. Chanel Boone made a formal statement under oath. In it, she revealed the extent of her relationship with Dennis Sutter, which had begun when she was Micah's girlfriend. She confirmed that Dennis had fathered both of her children. She described her life during those years as covert imprisonment. The DNA tests proved paternity. Lorene Sutter, whose health had been rapidly declining, passed away less than a year after Dennis's death. Her death certificate cited multiple organ failure and cardiac complications, but to those who knew her story, it was simply her body catching up to a life already taken from her. Her funeral was quiet. Few church members attended. In a parallel development, Micah Sutter's legal team filed a motion for case re-examination. The original witness, who placed him near the scene of the 2014 rape, recanted her testimony, stating she had been pressured to confirm a face she wasn't sure she saw. Another witness admitted to omitting key information to avoid being drawn into the case. These shifts, combined with the resurfacing of the phone call timeline, ultimately led to Micah's release in 2021 after nearly 7 years in prison. His name was not officially exonerated, but the conviction was vacated. He did not return home. Tonya, meanwhile, remained in county custody. In court, she appeared emotionless. When asked by the judge during a pretrial hearing if she had anything to say, she reportedly replied, "There's nothing left to fix, only the pieces to bury." And though she was no longer free, she had done what no one else had dared. She had turned every hidden truth into public record. Tonya Sutter's trial never reached a dramatic courtroom climax. In early 2022, her legal team negotiated a plea agreement, citing overwhelming evidence of long-term psychological trauma, abuse, and systemic failure. The charge was reduced to second-degree manslaughter, and she received a 20-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 10. She is currently serving time at Utah State Correctional Facility, where prison officials describe her as stable, cooperative, and extremely quiet. No disciplinary incidents have been recorded. Micah Sutter now lives in Nevada. He has no contact with his sister and hasn't spoken publicly since his release. Sources close to him say he's rebuilding slowly, one day at a time. Lorene Sutter's gravesite lies beside her parents in a small cemetery just outside Hurricane, Utah. Her headstone bears no scripture, just her name and the words, "She loved. She endured." If this story moved you, unsettled you, or made you question what silence can cost, subscribe. We tell the stories that others bury. You're watching True Crime Corner.